From Washington, this is VOA News. Hello, I'm Steve Miller. U.S. President Donald Trump has decided to end the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA program. It shielded 800,000 young undocumented immigrants from deportation. Democratic Senator Dick Durbin said he was disappointed by the president's move.
The first and only direct conversation which I've had with President Trump was the day of his inauguration, and I thanked him for the kind words he said about DREAMers and DACA. He looked me in the eye and he said, "Don't worry about those kids. We're going to take care of those dreamers."
Congress will have 6 months to act if it wishes to continue to allow those affected to remain in the United States. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Nikki Haley said that more sanctions on North Korea are unlikely to change the country's behavior.
The reasons we're pushing for so many sanctions, do we think more sanctions are going to work on North Korea? Not necessarily, but what does it do? It cuts off the revenue that allows them to build ballistic missiles.
Haley said on Monday she wants the United Nations Security Council to vote on September 11th to impose tougher sanctions on North Korea over its sixth and largest nuclear test. China and Russia say additional sanctions against Pyongyang will do little to ease tensions on the Korean peninsula. Hurricane Irma is the most powerful storm ever recorded in the Atlantic Ocean. The U.S. National Hurricane Center says the Category 5 storm has winds of up to 297 kph as it approaches the Leeward Islands of the Northeast Caribbean. Florida Governor Rick Scott is ordering the suspension of road tolls in that state so as residents can flee the area if they choose to evacuate. For additional information, follow Voice of America on social media. This is VOA News. Kenya's Electoral Commission says a new presidential election is to be held October 17th, but opposition leader Raila Odinga has rejected it, demanding election officials be investigated or fired before fresh polls are held. Jill Craig reports.
After Kenya's Supreme Court annulled last month's presidential election results that favored incumbent President Uhuru Kenyatta over opposition candidate Raila Odinga by a margin of about 1.4 million votes, the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission announced late Monday the new election will be held October 17th. But Odinga and his opposition coalition said Tuesday they prefer October 24th or 31st. Arguing there must be sufficient time to work out issues with the IEBC that necessitated the need for a new election in the first place.
We are saying that we are not ready to participate in elections on the 17th of October without legal and constitutional guarantees.
Jill Craig, VOA News, Nairobi.
The United Nations calls the suffering endured by millions of people in Yemen an entirely man-made catastrophe. Lisa Schlein has the story from the UN Human Rights Office in Geneva.
The United Nations reports there have been more than 11,700 civilians killed or injured in Yemen since the Saudi Arabian coalition began airstrikes against Houthi rebels in support of the government in March 2015. It blames more than 8,000 of the casualties on the coalition and more than 3,700 on the Houthis. The report says conflict, cholera, and severe food shortages have made Yemen the world's largest humanitarian crisis. The UN Human Rights Agency's chief of Middle East and North Africa, Mohammad Ali Ainsour, says Yemen's 18.8 million people need humanitarian aid and more than 10 million are in acute need of health care. UN Human Rights Chief Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein is repeating his call for an end to the fighting and for an independent international investigation to be established. Lisa Schlein for VOA News, Geneva.
The UN Refugee Agency says some 123,000 Rohingya refugees have fled to Bangladesh since violence erupted in Myanmar on August 25th. On Monday, they put the number at 87,000 refugees, but the latest number was the result of aid workers conducting new, more accurate counts in both established and makeshift camps. The second round of talks on renegotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement has ended amid resistance to discussing Mexico's low wages and large differences over dispute resolution mechanisms. Despite this, the head negotiators of all three countries said progress has been made. In Washington, I'm Steve Miller.
That's the latest world news from VOA.